Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about rational thinking, about critical thinking, logic. We're going to look quickly at what logic is not, what it is, a little bit about who created it, and then moving a little bit more into the technical side of how it actually functions, kind of in a systematic way. And so we want to look just kind of briefly. I don't want to go tremendously into depth about logic. I teach logic classes as well, but I don't want to get bogged down in the technical talk. I just want to give you kind of an idea of here's how logic works, and then we're going to move forward because we're going to be using quite a bit of logic and logical language and a little bit of technical understanding as well throughout the next few lectures. And so remember that with Socrates, the mood of philosophy moves away from the gods, it moves away from the divine, and he turns toward reason. He's turning towards some type of logical dialogue in his case, where you're trying to see if your ideas are logically consistent, or if they have some type of inconsistency, or if they fail at the level of definition, or whatever it might be. And so he's looking to, and he's turning to logic, and he's turning to reason. And so exploring a little bit about what logic is, what reason is. And one of the main reasons we're doing this at this point is because logic and reason is the main tool of the philosopher. In other scientific disciplines, they have their primary tools. If you're going to study the stars, one of your primary tools is going to be the telescope. If you're going to study microbiology, one of your primary tools is going to be a microscope. And so in philosophy, the primary tool is logic, it's reason. And so that's one of the reasons we're going to focus on it here, because Socrates is one of the first that moves towards that mindset, the mindset of the primary tool for understanding our reality is going to be logic. And so as he does that, we need to understand a little bit about what logic is. And we're going to start with what logic is not. Philosophers are looking for the ideal. They're looking for the best of. So the best government system, or the best system of education, the best, you name it, any kind of ideal, the best of, that's what they're looking for. And they're trying to find reasons for and support for, the best kind of educational system is ... And here are the reasons why. And logic has to back it up. It can't be because I like it or because I was taught that this is the best way. There's got to be some type of logical foundation for it, and this is the right way. So they're looking for ideals, and so it excludes several things. Logic does. Logic is not an appeal to the oldest ideas. Just because an idea is old, that doesn't mean it's good. Humanity has had slavery around for thousands and thousands of years. It's an old idea. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it good. It just makes it old. On the flip side of that, just because an idea is new, that doesn't make it good either. It just means that it's a new idea. So whether the idea is old or whether the idea is new makes no difference whatsoever. Is it logically consistent? Will it hold up under scrutiny? If you bring criticism against it, does it continue to hold up and say, no, this really is right or best or the ideal? Logic is also not looking for the most divinely inspired. And I'm not really sure how you would figure out, say, for example, of all the sacred texts that we've got in the world, which one of them is the most divinely inspired. I'm not even sure how you could put together a test to determine, and this one is the most divinely inspired of all of them. I'm not sure how that would work. But that's not what logic is after. It's not looking for divine inspiration. It's looking for some type of evidence through purely rational, logical thought. Logic does not concern itself with who's the most respected person in the community. Just because someone's respected, that doesn't mean that they're right. It's not looking at the person who's the most powerful in the community. Certainly we see lots of persons of power who abuse that power. Just because you're powerful, that doesn't mean you're right. And so logic is looking past that. It's also not looking for the authority of the past, in the sense of that just because you've always done it this way doesn't make it right. There's plenty of things that we always did it this way, but we can start doing it in another way. As I was raised, I'm older than the internet. Education always had books in the classroom. I don't currently use books in my classroom. And so that's something I've turned away from books, and I'm turning toward the internet. Just because I did something in the past, that doesn't mean I have to continue to do it in the future. Logic and reason can take over, and so I can abandon books, and I can begin to use a more easily accessible form of information passing, in this case, the internet. So just because it was always done that way doesn't mean we have to continue to do it. Logic will let us move past that type of thinking, because logic is going to be something that's more than just your emotions or your passions. You should take a situation and reflect on that situation, not just how is it engaging my passion or how is it engaging my senses, and so I'm having some type of emotional response to it. But logically, what you should be doing is that you should be reflecting on a situation before you dive in head first. It can save you a tremendous amount of anxiety if you will approach things from a logical perspective. Now, in a moment, I'm going to say, and there's a qualifier here, but for now, it can save you a lot of distress. It can save you a lot of trouble if you will embrace this idea of rational, logical thinking rather than impassioned, emotional responses to things as well. So, embracing that type of lifestyle, embracing this logical, rational type of lifestyle can be very, very helpful for you instead of diving in head first. And I grew up in kind of a rural community and out in the mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, and there we have a minimum security facility, and prisoners sometimes escape from it. It's minimum security. It's not really that hard to get out. The real trouble is how you're going to get anywhere, because you're out in the middle of the mountains and there's just nothing out there but trees and cows and mountains and rocks. And so one prisoner escaped, and he stole a car, but the car didn't have much gas, and so he ran out of gas really close to a place called Pipe Springs, which is correctly named because literally there is a spring, like a natural spring, and then someone jammed a pipe in it so that travelers through the mountains could stop and get some water. And thinking back before there were lots of places to stop and bottled water, you could stop your car and in the 50s and 60s and get a drink. So it's called Pipe Springs. Well, this fellow broke down there at Pipe Springs, and along the way, people would stop, but there was no restroom facility. Keep in mind that you're driving through the mountains, and it's about a 2-hour drive from a town on the north end of the mountains to a town on the south end of the mountains, so there's no restroom facilities. And at that time, when it was first built, there was also nowhere to stop and get a drink of water. And so you'd stop at Pipe Springs, you'd stop and get a drink, and then eventually they came in and they built a bathroom facility as well, which at the time of the fellow who escaped, it was nothing more than just a hole in the ground with a toilet seat. On top of it, it was basically an outhouse. And so this fellow escaped, and he had all these mountains that he could have run and hidden in, but instead of doing that, he had an emotional, a passionate response because he knew that the police were closing in on him. And so he decided to hide, and he decided to hide in the outhouse, but he didn't just decide to hide in the outhouse. He decided to hide in the pit of the outhouse. And so when you go into an outhouse and you sit down on the toilet, it's just an open hole in the ground, and all of that human waste goes into that hole, and it's about 8 feet deep, something like that. This guy decided to hide in that pit, but he didn't just decide to hide in that pit. He decided to dive into that pit head first. Now, fortunately for him, the toilet seat did its job, and a toilet seat keeps you from falling into the toilets, or in his case, into this pit. And so when the police arrived and they finally caught up with this fellow, they found him there with his head down into the pit and his feet up and kicking, and he was screaming at them and calling them all kinds of names, to get him out of the situation that he had put himself into. And so he dove in head first without thinking of the consequences. I say fortunately for him, the toilet seat did its job, because if he had actually managed to get into the pit, he would have landed in that pit of human waste head first, and there are any number of dangers of sickness that certainly could have brought, but there are other dangers as well. Imagine that he had succeeded in eluding the police officers so that he was then there in the pit. If the pit's 8 feet deep and the walls are covered in slime, he has no rope, he has no means of getting back out. of this pit. He might be in there until someone, finds him, or he might be in there until he dies. He really didn't consider his situation. He had an emotional and passionate response, dove in headfirst, did not think logically about the consequences of his actions. And so in life, you certainly want to try to embrace this idea of logic and reflecting on things logically as you move through your life. One of my professors said that he was concerned for his students because many of them seemed to think longer about what they were going to order for lunch than they did about who they were going to marry. And so I know that I've sat and pondered what I was going to order in a restaurant for quite some time, very, very indecisive. And then to think about it the way he put it, I could see many of my students and many of the people I know, maybe they jumped into marriage really, really quickly. And if you think about it for a moment, rationally, think about it logically, deciding who you're going to marry is going to have longer lifelong implications than deciding what you're going to eat for breakfast or lunch or dinner that day. And so certainly you'd want to spend more time and think more logically about marriage than you would about, should I get hamburger or pizza? But often people don't do that. And so we need to embrace this type of logical, critical thinking, certainly as we move forward in our lives. Now, it is also important that as we're thinking and trying to be logical people, we must remember that this is an appeal to us as individuals. We're trying to think of all the consequences of our actions. We're trying to think of what will happen, what will come about if we do X, Y, and Z. So on a personal level, it's going to be very, very important that we do embrace this particular type of lifestyle. But in order to really be able to do this successfully, we need to have a little bit of a study of logic. We need to have a little bit of understanding as we're moving forward in a philosophy class, not just because it's going to serve you somewhat in your daily life, and in a lot of ways it won't, because in a lot of ways you already behave logically in your life. And let me give you a simple example. In the morning when you get up, do you put on clothing before you shower? The clothing that you intend to wear throughout the day, do you put that on before you take a shower? Obviously not. If you did put it on before you showered and then you showered in your clothing, then you'd have to go around in wet clothing all day or change your clothes. Or if you put it on before you shower and then you take it off and then you shower and then you put it back on, that's silly. It's illogical. It's not reasonable. It's not going to be helpful. And so, yes, in a way, we already use logic in a very, very simple way, and we don't think about it most of the time. You just kind of do it. You think, eat my breakfast, then brush my teeth. Now, I know there are some very strange people out there who brush their teeth, then eat, and then brush their teeth again. You're weird, that's fine, it doesn't matter. But there's a logic in there, isn't there? Because maybe you don't want to eat food with a dirty night mouth, right? Morning breath. Okay, but there's a kind of logic in there. And so you already do and use logic throughout your life. But in this case, we're talking about something a little more technical. And so we need a little bit of understanding about about how logic functions in a more academic setting, in more of a rigorous, less kind of common knowledge, common sense, obvious type way. So we'll take a look at that. So the study of logic is the study of connections. You have to see what happens if this, then this, right? And I'm kind of glancing at the board here because we've got an if-then scenario here on the board. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. It's an if-then type of outlining of logic, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on that in just a moment. But you're looking for the connections. Do things connect? And if they connect, do they connect logically? And if this is true of one thing, how is it related to something else? And if we go this direction, how is it going to affect something over here? And so it becomes more of an academic approach and less of just that common sense, although common sense is certainly part of it. But again, logic is going to be the primary tool of philosophy. We're going to be using it a lot. We're going to try to understand it a lot. If anybody's ever asked you to be reasonable, they're asking you to try to, bring into your life this type of systematic logic instead of being emotional. Instead of being emotional, they're saying, come on, be a little bit more logical. Adopt this type of thing into your lifestyle. And don't be confused. There are times to respond emotionally. There are times to respond in passionate and impassioned manners. That's certainly going to be the case. You've got a strong survival instinct mechanism inside of you. That's great. Sometimes you need to respond to that. You need to, instead of letting emotion carry the day, you need to let logic carry the day. It's one of my favorite examples of that is, imagine that you're walking through the forest, through the jungle, and over on your left, kind of in the cane, you see a stripy figure that's kind of growling, and it seems to be creeping and moving along in such a way that it doesn't want you to see it. Now, you can do one of two things. You can sit down and make a list of all the good logical reasons that this stripy, growly figure might turn out to be a hungry tiger, or you can run. And you run. Why? Because of the passion, the emotion, not just, you don't sit down and make a logical scheme. You respond emotionally to something, and that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so what you have to do is you have to try to develop some type of wisdom when you can figure out when you should respond emotionally and when you should respond logically to any given situation. And so that can be a difficult thing to do, and it's something that requires wisdom and experience and, frankly, failure as well. And so that's part of philosophy. That's part of this lifestyle, knowing when to choose this one over that one. If you've ever been in love, certainly you know. Love can be a great thing, and sometimes people in love don't behave logically, and that can be good. That can be something that we want as part of the human experience, as part of our lives. But knowing when to respond in an emotional way and in a logical way when you're in love, again, wisdom, experience, trying to make sure that there's some kind of balance between them. But in our case, really, really focusing on logic. And when you're talking about philosophical issues and you're talking about some social issues and humanity trying to function, logic is going to be very, very useful. It's going to be one of our most important tools in our kit. There are some things that we respond to through instinct and training, to be sure. Again, you don't always have to sit down and make some kind of complicated logical system. You can just say, I want to go to the movies tonight, but I need to do my homework. And so the homework is due, tomorrow, and I won't have time to do it when I get home from the movies. What does that mean? It means I do my homework now, and then I'm free to go to the movies later. And then tomorrow when I get up, my homework's done, I go to class, everything is in good shape. That's a logical way of moving through your life. And again, you don't have to have that, this kind of technical stuff, but certainly for our job in this classroom, we're going to have some of this technical stuff as well. All right. Logic got put into a mathematical formulation because Descartes figured out that in math it works, it functions, and in a sense that it is step by step. And so if you have the right numbers and you make the right step, you get the right answer. And so in logic, he was looking for this type of foundation of thinking where if you put the steps in the right order, just like math, then you would come out with the right answers. Now, something like this, for example, with math, 2 + 2 = 4. That's just the way math functions. And as long as you put the right numbers in and you total them correctly, you have a step-by-step process. He wanted to give to thinking something that was equally valid, something that was equally structured so that people could plug in different thoughts and come up with correct answers just like you can in math. And so he gives to us this kind of logical geometrical thinking. And so in his case, he gave us premise, conclusion. Now, a premise is just it's just a statement. It's just this declaration of and this and that. And since premise A is true and since premise B is true, then the conclusion is true. Now, I'm making this overly simplified for our particular class. And for in logic, we're going to be going into more depth. But for in a logic class, more depth. But in our case, you can see how he just has this premise, this statement. If this statement is true and this statement is true, then in this case, necessarily this conclusion is going to be true. Now, there's some, as we'll see, there are going to be some ways in which that might not be the case. If one of the statements is untrue, or if there are other options that might be available. But just for us for now, kind of thinking about it in this simplistic mathematical way of thinking, trying to get logic into some type of formula where we could have some kind of certainty. And this is really the beginning of the technical, logical structure that we have today. It begins and it comes down to us from Descartes. And so I want to look a little bit at Descartes and just some of his biography this morning, just so we kind of have an understand of who he is and where he's going with, how he came to give us this particular mathematical formula for logic. His dates are 1596 to 1650. He started what's called the modern period of philosophy. We talked about that in the introductory or in the historical part of in the historical lecture part of the course. His thinking was so powerful it starts kind of a new period in philosophical thinking. He gives to us what's called analytical geometry, and that just is this process here. You can hear that geometry, it comes to us from the mathematical position, and then we're analyzing, in this case, thoughts. And so we get analogical geometry. We get analytical geometry from Descartes. He wasn't just limited to philosophy or to logic. He also contributed to optics and to physiology. His mother died the same year as his birth, and his grandmother raised him till she died when he was 10 or 11 years old. At that point, he was enrolled in a Jesuit school, and he was there for 9 years and was paced through a rigorous curriculum. Later, he earned a law degree from Poitiers, and he wrote a manual on fencing at the age of 22. He also fought as a mercenary in the Dutch Army's War of Independence from Spain. He also composed a mathematically based treatise on music, and then he fought as a mercenary for the Duke of Bavaria. Now, perhaps that's a little surprising because that's a pretty broad-reaching resume. There he is. He's got a law degree. I mean, he is literally going to write the book on fencing. He fights in 2 wars as a mercenary. It's not something you kind of expect from a philosopher, perhaps. And he composed a mathematically based treatise on music. Contributed to optics and to physiology. He was interested in, and he contributed to, a lot of different fields. Remember me telling you that philosophers are greedy and that they really try to be kind of involved in all of this. And you can kind of see this playing out, especially in the earlier philosophers. In today's society, we're much more specialized. But in their society, it was easier to go out and be involved in a broader array of disciplines and to be an expert in a broader array of disciplines. And so we shouldn't be really surprised. It's a little surprising. I remember being surprised that he was a mercenary. But then I started thinking about Socrates being a warrior, and you kind of start seeing a pattern. Just because they're philosophers, that doesn't mean, again, that they're old guys eating grapes, being fanned and thinking these kind of abstract thoughts. They were very practical, down to earth, very involved in the politics and the movements and even the wars of the days and times in which they lived. And so they're very much a part of the culture and the society in which they're involved. They're not sitting over here on their own, being influenced by none of it. All right, and so around the time that he was a mercenary for the Duke of Bavaria, he had 3 vivid dreams, and in those dreams, he was challenged, he said, to try to create some kind of original and daring path to knowledge. And so that's what's going to give us this, right? This kind of pathway using math, because math is so structured and so precise, and he wanted the same thing for thinking. But it was in these dreams that he was challenged with this. And so from that challenge in those dreams, he begins to try to develop this particular kind of analytical geometry in this case. And so, as it turns out, when Descartes was younger, he had health trouble that kept him in bed until midday. And so, at a time when people got up kind of with the sun because they didn't have the electricity like we do, it was something that was uncharacteristic. And so he spent hours and hours laying in bed, and as he laid there, he wasn't wasting time and he wasn't being lazy, but he was thinking and trying to, because of these challenges, trying to come up with this original way to come to knowledge, to come to true understanding. And so he may have been lying in bed when he conjured this thought. All right, now he puts it to us this way: only those objects should engage our attention to the sure and inducible knowledge of which our mental powers seem to be adequate. And what he means is that he wants to try to avoid things that are opinion. He wants to avoid things that are transitory. Now here, using one of those words, transitory, he wants to avoid opinion because opinions are unstable and they're often unfounded. They're just somebody's idea or somebody's thinking on a particular topic. Doesn't mean they're necessarily true. He wants to avoid things that are transitory, ideas that are transitory. If something's transitory, it means that it moves. We use the word trans as in to move. So for example, to transport something means that you take it from one port to another port. You transport. So say it was in France, and you move it from a port in France to a port in England. You transport. So it's a movement. He wants to avoid ideas that are transitory because they're in movement. Remember, if you're looking for a foundation for thought, you don't want thoughts that are going to move. So you want to avoid thoughts that are transitory. He wants to avoid things that are customary. Just because something's a custom, that doesn't mean it's right, useful, or a good foundation for ideas. He wanted to avoid mysticism and superstition, and he wanted to avoid prejudice. He wanted to try to find something that was firm and stable that wouldn't move, and in this case, he's thinking about logic. And so he's trying to build a system around logic so that it is in place, so that it is firm, and so that it won't move. But we have a system that we can use to judge all thoughts. We have a system that will allow us to have some type of criteria to judge ideas as either logical or illogical. And so as he's building these systems, as he's been challenged to build something like this, he turns here in this case to math, but he realizes that math is abstract. It can't really tell us anything. 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't really help us in any way except to say if I have 2 apples and I add 2 more apples to my basket, I have 4. That's not going to help us. It's a little too cold and a little too calculating. We need something that's a little bit more warm, a little bit richer, something that will help us. He's going to say there's nothing really wrong with math, but there's nothing really right about it either, because it doesn't have the power to discover. It doesn't have a power to influence. All it can do is say that this is the case. It's accounting and measuring, some type of standard that we can use, but it's not going to help us ultimately as we're trying to make decisions. And so he's trying to put mathematics into some type of logical system, but he also recognizes and understands that it's limited, math is. And so trying to use mathematical systems, but trying to make it helpful in more of a mental, more of a technical way of deciding, and these ideas are right, good, and true. Now, turning a little bit more to the technical side, and kind of quickly here, like I said, not a logic class, but we need some of this, right? And so Descartes understands mathematics, and then he's going to say, we're going to try to get a way of thinking, develop a way of thinking that's as reliable as mathematical equations. So we have here our premise, conclusion, and we can see up here that I've got if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. That's just the technical talk. That's that kind of, if this is the case, and then this is the case, therefore, dot, dot, dot. And so what I've done here is I've given us 2 statements and a conclusion. So I'm following this format, PPC, right? Premise, conclusion. Logic gets really, really more complicated than this, but for us, for now, this is going to be kind of simplistic. It's what we needed. It's good enough for what we're going to be doing. So listen to this statement. See if you think it's logical and it holds, or see if you think there's a problem. Is it a good argument? Here we go. If it rains, the street gets wet. The street is wet, therefore it rained. So I'll say it again. If it rains, the street gets wet. The street is wet, therefore it rained. Is that a good argument? Most of the time, right away. I mean, I don't have to wait very long. My students are looking at this, and almost immediately heads start shaking. No, this is not a good argument. Why not? Well, there could be other causes for the street getting wet other than rain, couldn't there? Well, yeah. Just because the street is wet, that doesn't mean that it rained. There are alternative options. And so I remember one time going out of my apartment, and my friend who lived across the street in another apartment had a little Volkswagen, and a water main had broken underneath her car, and the utility people were afraid to turn the water off because they said the water pressure as it was bubbling up under her car was the only thing that was keeping her car from collapsing and falling into the water main. And so they had to go get a tow truck and tow the car before they could turn the water off. It wasn't raining, but I've got to tell you, those streets were very, very wet from all the water that was gushing out from this break in the water line. The streets were wet, but it had not rained, and it was not raining. It's not a good logical, step-by-step argument. And so most people can see this right away. It's pretty easy. It's pretty simple. It's pretty obvious that, no, that's not going to work. Like I said, there is a common sense element in logic. It gets much, much more complicated later on, but this is going to serve us, at least for now. So here is... here's another argument put out in logical fashion, premise, conclusion. See if you think it's a good argument. All spiders have 6 legs. All 6-legged creatures have wings. Therefore, all spiders have wings. I'll read it again. All spiders have 6 legs. All 6-legged creatures have wings. Therefore, all spiders have wings. Obviously, right away, there's going to be a problem here logically. But it's going to be a different type of problem than if it rains, the streets get wet, the streets are wet, therefore it rained. It's a different type of problem. The problem with this particular logical argument is that it makes a false claim. Now, in this case, it's not making a false claim. If it rains, the street is going to get wet. That's not a false claim. And the street is wet is also not a false claim. The problem here, the false conclusion here is the problem. In this case, in the argument with the spiders and them having 6 legs, the problem is that one of these is false. Spiders don't have 6 legs. Spiders have 8 legs. And so right away, there's a problem. And if one of your premises is untrue, then your conclusion in this type of logical argument structure is going to be untrue. Now, there are other types of logical structures where if one of your premises is untrue, the conclusion still could be true. But in this case, spiders have 6 legs. That's not true, and therefore the conclusion is going to be false. All 6-legged creatures have wings is also not true. There are 6-legged creatures that don't have wings, and so both premises are false in this case, and so the conclusion is also going to be false. And so from this, and again, it's pretty commonsensical. You can kind of see right away why Descartes, how he's building this, that it's going to be something that is commonsensical, but eventually, as we get a little bit more technical and we start moving away from wet streets and how many legs spiders have, it's going to be useful and it's going to be important. For now, it's just kind of simple. There's another type of argument that is going to be, it's going to have issues, and this is really one that's it's harder to spot. It's also harder to get people to stop thinking in this way. So I've got a Dilbert cartoon here that I'm going to read to you. And Dilbert the man is having a conversation with he's having a conversation with Dogbert, his dog, right? So these two persons are having a conversation. And this is a circular argument, and that just means that what you're doing is you're founding one of your premises, in this case, conclusion, but that conclusion is not based on, is not coming from the premises. Instead, it is coming from a circle of argument. And let me just read it and see with this example if this helps. And so Dilbert says, and we know mass creates gravity because dense planets have more gravity. And Dogbert asks, how do we know which planets are more dense? And Dilbert replies, they have more gravity. And Dogbert says, that's circular reasoning. Dilbert, in the end, just kind of as the joke says, he prefers to think of it as having no loose ends. But as you can see there, if you start with this particular premise and it leads itself back around, if your logic itself moves in that kind of circle, you don't have a foundation. You're just arguing in a circle. It has mass, therefore it has more gravity, and it has more gravity because it has more mass, and it has more mass because it has more gravity, and it has more gravity because it has more mass. And you just keep going in this circle, and so it's not a good way of thinking. It needs to be based on some type of, your thinking needs to be based on a premise, and the premise needs to be true. It also needs to be directly related to the next premise. There can't be any kind of non sequitur. They have to be related to each other. You know, I believe in unicorns, therefore porcupines love peanut butter. You can't make that kind of move. They have to be connected. You started with I believe in unicorns, and therefore dot dot dot, and therefore dot dot dot. Is the way it has to go. You can't jump. They have to be interrelated. So you can't move in a circle. Your premises can't be false. And there can't be other alternatives, like with the street is wet. There might be other reasons that the street is wet. And that's just really, really fast. That's really kind of the basics of logical argumentation. And so, again, I don't want to get hugely bogged down in the technical talk. All these qualifiers are going through my head, and I'm sorting through, and I'm just saying we don't need that much. We don't need all of these things right now. We just need the basics for what we're going to be doing in philosophy. Keep in mind that there are rules for logic. It's not anything goes. The rules for logic are as firm and as real, just as real as the rules of chemistry or the rules of physics. It's just the same way in the sense of that they're just as real and they're just as set, and they're just as discoverable. And so as we're moving forward, trying to think about logic and trying to use logic to guide ourselves as we're having these types of discussions, try to leave emotion and try to leave passion in the realm where they belong. And they're great. I think humans are two things. I think we're both logical and I think we're emotional. I think we need both of those things in order to be stable, in order to be balanced, and to have a good life. But we have to know when to use which one. And so just kind of some quick understanding of logical principles, quick understanding of there are rules in logic, and you can't just dismiss them any more than you can dismiss the rules of gravity. A good argument, kind of quickly here as we're ending, a good argument, a good logical argument looks like this. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. All men are mortal. Now, if it's true that all men are mortal, and I'm going to say that it is, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, what's the most logical conclusion? Well, Socrates is mortal. If you want to disprove the conclusion that Socrates is mortal, all you have to do is do one of two things. You just have to disprove one of the two premises. You can disprove that all men are mortal. So if you can come up with some man who is immortal, great. This premise is proven false, therefore this conclusion could be false. And so if you disprove either premise, you can show that the conclusion is false. So if all men are mortal, if that's true, but you can somehow prove that Socrates is not a man, say that you could prove that Socrates was somehow a god, well, Socrates is a man, that second premise would be proven incorrect, and therefore the conclusion would be false. But as long as all men are mortal, and as long as Socrates is a man, necessarily, logically, Socrates is mortal, and that's going to be necessary. And you'd have to prove one of those first two premises false in order to prove the conclusion was in fact false. And that's how logic works. That's what it's going to give to us as we move forward. Make a statement in one of the discussions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the statement and I'm going to try to find any type of contradiction or some type of false premise. Or what about an alternative, like with the streets being wet? Could it actually be this way? And so that's what we mean by engaging in this type of logical, by engaging in this type of rational dialogue. We can come to understand things better. We can come to understand our own thoughts and our own ideas, our own positions certainly better, and we can defend them in a better way rather than being emotional or rather than resorting to name-calling or even to violence itself. And so what we're after is a way to try to begin to think like Descartes was after, a way to try to incorporate some type of method to that thinking process. We want to use logical thinking. We want to use that type of method as we're having our discussions, and perhaps even as we move forward in our lives, if more people are using that type of logical progression of thinking, that way of looking at it and seeing alternatives and understanding both sides of arguments and understanding when an argument is strong or when an argument is weak, perhaps somehow we get a better society through that type of rational, logical thinking as well. So just kind of a quick overview of what logic is, where it came from, how it's structured, why it's structured that way, and hopefully what it can offer to us as we move forward in this class, but then also what it can offer to us as we move forward in our different societies and in our lives as well. And so we will see you next time as we move forward again, discussing a little bit more about logic.